Hi, today's video blog is about adaptability and reframing. We'll also talk a little bit about resilience. If we try and look up a definition of adaptability, it kind of leaves a little bit to be desired in a dictionary definition. So I'm going to use a definition from my own internal organisation. Adaptability is about being able to identify trends, identify train wrecks, being able to identify customers' needs. It's about thriving in the grey zone. It's about reframing things, seeing things from a different perspective, being resilient and reaching across networks. Let's unpack this a little bit, and I'll try and serve up some anecdotes and some examples of these various different dimensions of adaptability. Before we do unpack this, why is adaptability important? In today's ever-changing workplace environment, there's a lot of stressors impacting us. We are going to hit setbacks. We have to acquire the skill of resilience. We can get better at being resilient instead of just relying on the school of hard knocks. There are some transferable skills that you can learn to be more adaptable and perhaps thrive in this ever-changing workplace environment, which can cause some stress. So let's go ahead and try and unpack this a little bit. As far as identifying trends is concerned, I can give a couple of examples here. Back in my project days, it was very important to be proactive and look ahead at trends. One trend that I used to look at early in a project, first few months, was the trend of contingency usage. Contingency is an allowance in a project, large project, for unknowns. And you would take your contingency sum and put it over a timeline and have a baseline burn rate for your contingency. If after a few months your actual burn rate on your contingency for unknown items looked as if it was above the planned rate, it was a leading indicator of possible overspend situation in your project. The key to this was being proactive, looking for those trends, getting ahead of the issue, and then looking at some mitigation steps to try and avoid what the leading indicator was showing as a risk. So that's one example of identifying trends. Another one might be a market trend like labour costs, collective bargaining agreements spiralling out of control, a disturbing trend on these labour costs happening, period over period, could be a leading indicator of problems with outlying years' operational budgets. So again, trying to get ahead of that and making management aware of that kind of risk is a characteristic of being adaptable, being proactive and getting out there and looking for problems and trying to solve them before they actually become a train wreck. Now that's the next one, identifying train wrecks. I have a little anecdote from a recent project that I was project manager on. This could have been a simple little problem, but I identified it as a train wreck, possible train wreck. The project was nearing completion within a few months of completion date, and one of the outstanding items was a fire hydrant test, a pressure test, and that test failed. Now, you may have seen that as possibly just a little operational hiccup. I identified it as a possible train wreck, and we brainstormed, the team brainstormed some engineering solutions to the problem, but also some scheduling workarounds, and we even looked at worst possible case, how would we communicate putting off a highly publicised opening date, how would we communicate with senior executives in the worst case scenario. So not only did I have a plan A, I had a plan B, a plan C, and then a backup plan for a worst case scenario, which was on the communications work stream. So that's an example of identifying a train wreck and getting ahead of the issue, and hopefully, heading the issue off, putting proper risk mitigation steps in there to head off that particular possible train wreck. Now, this project that I'm talking about, we did, one of the alternate plans did work, the engineering solution worked, and we headed off that potential train wreck. Let's think about identifying customer needs. That's kind of nuanced problem, right? We all have heard that maxim that the customer is always right. I would say there's a kind of nuance to that, sure, if the customer has clearly defined needs, there's no need to be adaptable or become adaptive as far as the customer needs is concerned. Implement them, meet those customer needs. Often is the case, though, that those customer needs may change part of the way through the project. If that is the case, then yes, be adaptable and adapt to the new customer needs, and action them, make them real, meet those customer needs. If, however, you feel as if the customer is acting in a capricious manner, or these are not real needs, you should feel empowered. Part of being adaptable is to push back on that customer and perhaps use your consultative communication skills and point out that those changes at this time may be ill-advised. Let's think about thriving in the grey zone. So there's a particular training course by Gary Bowles. It's a PMI training course, training adaptable workers. I'll show a link to that down below so you can look it up. It's awesome training, and that talks about the fact that the old model was you had a current state, you implemented some change management, and you got to some idyllic future state. That was the old model. It appears now that you have a current state, you have change management, you have change going on, you never reach this idyllic perfect future state. Change is just ever present. Our goals change from day to day, maybe not from day to day, but are constantly changing, constantly evolving, and that is the reality of the current workplace. So instead of being stressed out by that ever-present change, try and adapt to it and learn to thrive within that grey zone. Be comfortable with that ever-present change. We talked about being resilient. It's a key component of being adaptable. And I think this is actually a life skill. It's obviously important for the business environment, but it's also important for your own personal life, right? There's a quotation out there: it doesn't matter how many times you fall, what matters is how many times you rise. Nelson Mandela is credited, amongst others, for saying that. When you really think about that, it's all about getting back up when you face a setback. There's a few examples of that, and I'll give you one from my own personal experience. At a point of conflict, it could be a negotiation, it could be a conversation, it could be a presentation, but you hit a point of conflict which makes you feel uncomfortable, you're stressed. Learn, practice taking a moment, taking a breath at that point of conflict when it hits you between the eyes, and it has me often in my work experience. Take a moment, take a breath, recognize that you're stressed. Actually, internally say those words: I am stressed at this moment. And actually consider the 3 normal stress responses for a human being. And that is fight, flight, or freeze. Consider those. This may feel like it's going to take an eternity. It doesn't. It takes but a moment, right? People aren't aware of it. So take a moment, consider those 3 stress responses, and decide proactively not to respond in one of those typical stress responses, fight, flight, or freeze. Instead, come up with a rote response. Learn this, right? It's a learned behaviour. A rote response, be a little bit vulnerable, and simply say, oh, that wasn't a response I was expecting. I'm a little bit taken aback by that. I need a moment to just consider that comment. Just give me a moment and let that moment stretch out a little bit. Now you can think about that then and then say, has anyone got any ideas, or is there an alternative, or you've got another set of responses then, or you can simply say, let's park that and we'll come back to it later. The whole point there is be resilient, take the moment of conflict and take a breath and just give yourself some time instead of reacting on one of those three normal human responses to conflict and stress. I have another example which I'm going to give you in just a minute. So the second example, as far as resilience is concerned, is to reframe failure. In many modern companies, if you can take a point of conflict, it may not be a point of conflict, it could be any perceived failure, perceived by you or perceived by others. If something has caused you to think that you have failed in your endeavour, try reframing that, right? So use another one of those skills that we're talking about, reframing that situation so that if you learn from your experience and you grow from that learning, then turn the perception of failure to a perception of a successful learning experience. Let me talk about reaching across networks. That's one of the key components of being adaptable. And when I talk about reaching across networks, what I'm talking about is across functions within a company, across divisions within a company, or even across companies. If you need to reach across networks to reach your desired result, then do so. And that is a key characteristic of being adaptable. I'll give you an example. Within our own internal organisation, a very specialised function was having some trouble with shipping. After several years of extensive analysis, the analysis came up with that there were 4 internal organisations and 1 external service provider who all shared accountability or a piece of the business process, and each one was to a greater or lesser extent dysfunctional. And that was the root cause. A suite of problems was the root cause of these shipping failures. Now, the problem with that was there was no single owner. The meeting I was in, the executive VP for one of the internal groups decided that that was a key first step, and she stepped forward and she said, okay, our group, the function within which I reside, our group will take ownership of this, and we will select a program manager, which was me, and we will form a highly matrix cross-functional team which will be empowered to solve this suite of problems. And that's what we've done over the past 12 months. A highly empowered team have been effective in addressing this suite of problems in a fairly complex concept, but fairly simple to realise. And we're just about at the end of that project now. So the point about that is that executive VP demonstrated that adaptability to reach across networks and say, okay, we will solve this problem, no matter who really owns the problem or if there's a group ownership, which is very difficult to deal with. So what's the last thing we want to talk about is reframing, right? So reframing is a key dimension to adaptability, and really means seeing things from another person's perspective. I'm going to give you another anecdote about reframing, and it involved me being called in as in a consultative capacity, even though it was internal within our own organisation. And it was about the bad behaviour of a service provider. I sat in a fact-finding meeting, internal only, and I listened for an hour on a whole litany of complaints about ineffectiveness, bad behaviour, a lack of productivity, you name it. There was a list of complaints about the service provider. And what I realised over the course of an hour, sitting quietly taking a lot of notes, was there were a lot of same opinions in the room. There was a lot of group think going on. And I thought it was important to have a different perspective in there. The service provider was not in the meeting, wasn't invited. So from some previous research that I had done and some of the notes that I took at the meeting, I said, well, okay, can I have the floor for the last 5 minutes of the meeting, and can I have your permission to do a little bit of role playing where I will play the role of the service provider, just to provide a different perspective from the perspective in the room. And there was a kind of reluctant agreement from the team in the room. Fairly large team this was, a large group that I was talking to. And I got up and I put on my service provider hat, and I commenced to give a whole litany of complaints about bad behaviour and lack of good business decisions within our own organisation from the service provider's perspective. I only did that for 5 minutes, and the group were very disappointed and did not agree with anything that I had put forward. Coming out of that meeting a few days later, I was appointed to come up with a win-win strategy to try and save the relationship. A key component to that, we iterated a few different versions, and we eventually came up with a win-win strategy for that service provider. But the key component to that, the key step, if you like, was trying to put on the service provider's hat, right? So by doing that in that meeting, I opened a few eyes, I think, from team members, which made it easier to come up with the win-win strategy eventually. But also it prepared me for when I sat down with the service provider and I got almost word for word that series of complaints. So to see that from another's perspective and come up with a successful win-win strategy, I actually coined that phrase in this particular circumstance, to come up with a win-win strategy. That was the only path forward to save that partnership, right? And it was very successful. So to sum up, what are we talking about? We're talking about being adaptable. We're talking about a key component of that adaptability being resilience, both in your personal life and in your business life, and the ability to reframe things from another's perspective, all being key survival techniques in the current ever-changing business environment. Thank you. Goodbye.